All right, so hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be reacting to How Did Medieval Soldiers Train for War in the documentary series by Invicta. I'll leave their link in the description. You should go check them out. And all my stuff's also down there if you want to support me. Otherwise, I will try to add anything I can. I'm pretty familiar with medieval stuff, and it is one of my more favorite subjects that I do like to study, especially the military side of it. But politically, it's also interesting to me. So I'll try to add something. Otherwise, let's get to it.
It is common in medieval and fantasy media to see soldiers training for war. Often this gets depicted by having a few soldiers sparring with a clash of swords, or archers practicing with a few arrows shot at a target. This gets the job done narratively, but is it really how soldiers would have trained? In this video, we will take a look at how medieval warriors actually prepared for battle. Providing specifics on how medieval soldiers trained for battle can be difficult given the wide geographical and temporal scope of the era. As one might imagine, things varied from place to place and from time to time. In addition, our historical record can be quite limited, especially when it comes to the affairs of the non-elite members of society, who mostly get overlooked by our ancient chroniclers.
This is very important too, especially in Western Europe. Usually everything was in Latin if you're writing anything in a book, and it was basically focused on the elites. And let's being very honest with you, not a lot of people could read, and of the people that could read, some of them were aristocrats. Most of them were monks and church members. But yeah, a regular guy more likely can't read. Again, generally, if we start going later periods when you have the printing press and stuff, then of course it starts to disseminate. But yeah, records are not usually kept about, hey, this dude went to the longbow range and he's like a freeman and he practices, and him and his buddies have shooting competitions. Like, that's not written down.
That being said, we can still provide a general answer to the question at hand by looking at the broader trends of the medieval world. Who were these medieval soldiers, and what were they even training for? When it comes to the who, it must be noted that the vast majority of medieval armies were composed of ad hoc formations of non-professionals. Your generic army would have included a core force of an aristocrat's retinue, which was augmented by non-aristocratic freemen and mercenaries.
So let's take a back example. If we go back a little bit, like just to get you a generalized term of like how proportional everything was, if let's just take 10,000. Let's say you have an army of 10,000. You would have around 1,000 aristocrats, maybe in the retinue, and aristocrats. You would have 1,000, 2,000, maybe mercenaries. That's being generous. So you're at 3,000, and then 7,000 would be the freemen. It's just how it was. And that's saying a lot, even if you had a 10,000 army, which you're not going to. But that's generally like the percentages of stuff.
As for what battle looked like, well, it varied significantly. Most of the time, medieval warfare was of low intensity. Think small forces dealing with local bandits or raiders. Larger conflicts featuring pitched battles and sieges still occurred, but were simply rarer. We cover this topic in greater depth in our episode on How to Raise a Medieval Army, which you should definitely check out as a primer for this video.
And I did a video on that I will leave somewhere in the time card up there. You should go check it out, my reaction to that. And you should go watch that video too.
Suffice to say, each type of warrior would have had a different approach to training for battle. This was a reflection of their socio-economic status and the type of fighting they were expected to be involved in. Let's now cover each of these in greater detail. We will begin with the training of an aristocrat's retinue. On a societal level, medieval aristocrats and gentry placed a great deal of emphasis on their role as warriors, who were expected to both command armies and fight in battle directly. As individuals of great means, they could devote significant resources towards this goal. After all, they had the most money for gear and the most time for martial pursuits in their day-to-day life.
The best way to describe this to a modern day audience would be like they're actors, or someone that basically. So let's just take for example like a Hollywood actor that's made it big, like Chris Pine or Chris Evans. They have enough money to they don't need to work basically a day in their life, and their whole thing is just being societal. Okay, so they're gonna be societal. They're going to train nothing but train. All their food is provided to them. All their money they get is provided for their lands, right? So all they have to do is train and be socialites. So that's going to lead to a lot more proficiency in those two fields, rather than the peasant that has to work, 8 hours a day and then go off and work out if he wants to, right? It's just how it is.
Yet this group was certainly not monolithic, and one should expect the retinue to fall along a spectrum of means. A common catch-all term for these warriors is the men-at-arms. This is used by our sources to describe knights and troops of lesser status who were able to afford heavy armor and war horses.
And it depends what you would classify terms of men-at-arms as, right? So generally, I wouldn't classify knights as men-at-arms. You could, but they're more aristocrats. However, men-at-arms definitely could afford plate armor if they did it long enough and they had the means to do so. They could have war horses. They could have transporting to transport them there. They could also, in theory, fight in these formations. It would be probably more on the outskirts because nobles don't like, lower socioeconomic status guys near them on the wings and stuff, right? So they could be on the wings, so they probably wouldn't be in the general formation. But again, it depends. The French Commandery, and they have other different horse units that could actually just be men at arms, which were basically it's basically guys that aren't fully nobles, but they're as close as professional soldiers as you can get.
In battle, such men were expected to equip themselves as cavalry. However, men-at-arms could also fight dismounted as the situation demanded, such as when holding defensive positions or carrying out sieges.
But generally, they did fight mounted. Now, the English knights, did prefer to fight on foot. Okay, they are the one exception. English knights prefer to fight on foot, and they had different armor configurations to fight on foot. French guys generally prefer to fight on horseback. It depends where you are in the setting, like Europe, where exactly you are and what the requirements are for if you're mounted or not. But yeah, generally mounted is the preferred method.
Either on horse or on foot, though, they would often be the ones to bear the brunt of the fighting.
This is true. If you look at Agincourt, the men at arms, which was basically all the nobles and their very high aristocratic retinue of men at arms, were the ones that had to basically hold the entire French army off and stop them in that little sector while the longbows, did their job. And it was just like 1,000 of them. That's it. But yeah, they have to do the majority of the actual fighting as these guys.
Now on to training. A quick note on sourcing here is that we have significantly more reference material from the late medieval period as literacy rates improve and writing of all types gets more popular.
And this is because of the printing press, and you don't have to write everything in Latin anymore and stuff like that.
For example, we get all sorts of poems, songs, biographies, and technical manuals that reveal how the elites viewed training.
This is true because HEMA, so the historical martial art of Europe, something along that nature, does use these manuals from the later period. We don't have anything really from the early periods, but some later periods, like Tollhofer, they train on these manuals today for HEMA, which is what they would use for those manuals. So it's probably what they would use back then, honestly, too. So.
In royal courts, it was even a popular trend to display one's wealth and culture by funding the production of books on chivalry. Meanwhile, in medieval Islamic culture, such writings on military topics were so widespread that they became a major genre of Arabic literature, known as Furusiya.
See, I didn't know that. This is something new. Learning something new every day is actually very, very good.
So what do we learn from these texts? Well, the body of available evidence largely points to a more personal level of training as opposed to any collective formation drill. That isn't to say it didn't happen at all, just that men-at-arms typically trained as individuals or small groups.
And it makes sense, right? You don't have usually time to gather all 10 of your friends up to fight or practice anything. Like today, let's just say call 10 of your friends to meet up and practice, right? Versus all of you are going to practice. So let's just say all of you guys are on a soccer team. Usually are going to go like run or do something, right? Not as a group, usually not as a group. You'll do it sometimes as a group, right? But mainly you're going to do it by yourself for personal training. So that's just an example I could give off for you guys.
So what did this look like? For the aristocracy, young boys would have been encouraged to wrestle, play with swords, and observe their elders. More formal and structured training probably began in their early teens.
I could do a whole video on that, but Page, Squire, Knight, basically taught from 7, 14 up to 21, um, different levels of fighting techniques.
This would have involved developing a baseline of stamina, endurance, and strength, as indicated in some texts we have on the lives of famous knights. An emphasis on physical training was likely reinforced by the popular book De Re Militari by Vegetius, which references the activities practiced by Roman legionaries. In terms of technical training, it seems that swordsmanship and fencing were key parts of knightly military education. By the late medieval period, people began to write all sorts of technical manuals on the matter. However, these were never the primary mode of instruction. Rather, aristocratic warriors in training would have learned by doing, with older and more experienced warriors tutoring younger swordsmen directly.
And this is even true today. It's better to have someone actually personally train you rather than just read a book. For example, take a math book out and try to learn, like, I don't know, calculus, right? Versus having somebody you pay that's going to work one on one with you to actually teach you calculus. Again, yeah, so personal training, I would see that as being a better, more efficient way of doing it. But again, the manuals are there just in case you needed them.
Additional skills involved learning to ride a horse and perform mounted combat with both sword and lance. In these matters, the popular activity of hunting would have proved quite instructive for learning how to traverse rough terrain, work as a team, and corral a target.
Now, this is very important, which a lot of people do not discuss, and I'm glad they brought this up. So, hunting for the nobility in the medieval period was it's like one of the best things you could do, and it's like one of the premier prestigious things you could do. That's why they had royal reserves, right? Of just forests you couldn't hunt in. If you did hunt, you would die. You'd be executed. And as what these were was basically the aristocrats would all gather up. There'd be like 10 of them, or however many they're going to have. They're going to have their dogs. They're going to have their falcons or horses. They're going to have their bows. They're going to go hunt. And it was a very important pastime that the nobles did. And it's not very talked about, but it was one of the most important things they did. So they'd track, they'd hunt, they'd scout, and do all these sorts of things to get their target. And then once they got their target, it would be like, masked on the wall, and they'd be able to display for prestige purposes.
Corral a target. Tournaments or jousts also provided aspiring knights a way to practice in a more military setting. Demonstrating skill and prowess could win individuals renown among their peers, adding a level of cultural importance to the practical motivations of becoming better at fighting.
Another thing with the joust is mainly just for knights to, display their stuff. You could do judicial duels. There's a whole bunch of stuff you get into: judicial duels, tournaments, fighting for a place in a prestigious, guard or a prestigious position. There's a whole bunch of stuff why knights did the tournaments. And it was kind of outlawed by the church, but people still did it. And then it wasn't outlawed by the church. Basically, the fact that you could die is what pissed the church off. Is like, you are fighting and you could die for what? Vanity, which is why the church didn't like it. Yeah.
Better at fighting. At the end of the day, though, this peacetime training could only go so far. Yes, practice was important, but there was no substitute for experiencing war firsthand. To that end, military musters were important occasions for younger soldiers to learn the ropes of how to organize and conduct themselves within a larger force. Most of the time, this would culminate in some smaller action like a skirmish, raid, or minor siege.
That is something I was brought up. I was wondering how they would train as a military unit, and I was like, I don't think they would. But he does bring up a good point. When the army would scatter out to go in their smaller units of like 100, 200 guys, it makes sense that they would, if they met any resistance, like any small resistance, they would actually be able to train here, form up, and, get their first combat experiences in as an actual unit. That makes a lot more sense.
The big affairs, pitched battles and massive sieges, were rare. For context, we can look at the career of John de Rither, a 66-year-old man-at-arms from the 100 Years' War. Though he had participated in combat from the age of 19, he had only personally fought in 3 large-scale pitched battles.
He's 66, 19 to 66, and he only fought 3 pitched battles. That shows you that's why those pitched battles, we remember them in the medieval times, because they were so rare.
Because hands-on experience was so valuable and major action was so rare, veterans were in high demand when it came to medieval military training. Boys were encouraged to listen to their stories and observe them in action. If these young knights were lucky enough, they might even have a veteran tutor take charge of their instruction. Yet no matter how much practice or direct experience one accumulated, these skills would degrade over time. There was no formalized structure for ongoing military training, which meant that it was up to the individual how much effort they dedicated to maintaining their fighting edge.
And this is highly dependent. And the reason he says it degrades over time is there was no military academy, there was no professional standing army. There would be nowhere to centrally train to keep all these guys, have them write their books and stuff. It was just the more you did it, the better you guys got, and then it would keep going up, and then when you stopped, it would go down again. And yeah, it just depends if you're fighting guys and the individual to keep the levels up, basically.
It's for this reason that some medieval writers advocated for knights to go out and seek foreign wars in peacetime, so as to remain at the top of their A game.
Something I didn't know, and so yeah, that makes sense.
We can now talk about the next group of medieval soldiers, the non-aristocratic freemen. This was a diverse group whose combat roles would have varied widely depending on their income. The wealthiest would serve as men-at-arms, riding atop horses in heavy armor, while poorer individuals might fight light cavalry, footmen, or skirmishers. Yet, despite existing at a lower tier on the military pecking order, commoners were often just as proud of their military service and skills as the aristocracy. Even if they had less resources at their disposal, non-aristocratic soldiers still took care to prepare for battle.
And something you hear about is they were also proud of their service. You would usually hear that it's just the peasants of unwashed people, and they wouldn't want to be there. Not strictly true all the time. For like the Battle of Agincourt, and even before then, when the English invaded, all the guys that went over there basically wanted to be there. Yeah, and they're proud of their military service, and it makes sense. You're like fighting for your king at this point, and your service, it can be passed down to your kids.
Medieval freemen were generally required to own weapons. This obligation was scaled to their level of income, with proclamations such as the English Assizes of Arms, spelling out exactly what sort of gear one should own. However, not all could bear arms. Minority groups like Jewish men in Christian areas were often banned from owning weapons and forced to sell off any they possessed. For those who did acquire war gear, the next step would be to familiarize themselves with its use. In this regard, we have a large body of evidence which shows that commoners, especially urban citizens, sought to train and participate in a culture of arms. In many towns and cities across Europe, especially Flanders, shooting guilds for archers, crossbowmen, and gunpowder weapons were common.
This makes sense because I actually did have like an archery guild kind of thing I did. But it makes sense, right? And you're just basically all you're doing is you're practicing your skills and you're just seeing who's the best shot, who has the best, everything. And it can build camaraderie, and I see why they would do this. Why they have shooting guilds for stuff like this.
Members of these prestigious groups participated in peacetime shooting competitions and served their cities in war. Legislation attempted to control such activities and curb any civic disorder which might result from a bunch of commoners adopting weapons.
Of course, you can't have people armed. Can't have people armed because then they could rebel.
Late medieval England famously required freemen to practice archery, with towns being obliged to maintain publicly accessible archery targets. The purpose of these laws was both to encourage training and attempt to reduce public disorder by banning gambling and other morally suspect pastimes.
Yeah, we'll ban gambling. We'll see how far that goes. All you need to do is look at the USA and see how that went.
As we discussed with the aristocratic soldiers, most training was achieved through practical experience in combat. Big battles were rare, and so veterans again proved key in sharing their knowledge with the wider group of trainees. Some communities attempted to make up for the lack of real combat through mock battles. Italian cities, for instance, carried out little battles or shield games, where combat was fought using shields and blunt batons. By the late medieval period, however, these communal games had fallen out of favour as armed forces became more professionalised.
Something you didn't know about Italy, but it is a cool fact. Yeah, they would do that.
The last element of the medieval army we will talk about are the mercenaries. Such hired troops were a vital part of medieval military forces, since most states at the time had few standing forces and limited resources to expand their pool of effective soldiers. Many soldiers, identified by our sources as mercenaries, were actually provided as part of a political alliance or treaty, especially in the early Middle Ages. The stereotypical image of medieval mercenaries depicted in most media comes primarily from the later medieval period, when larger groups of free companies were indeed available for hire, especially in 14th and 15th century Italy. Regarding their composition, mercenaries were drawn from the same range of backgrounds as normal medieval soldiers. That is to say, both aristocrats and commoners became mercenaries, and they almost all began their military careers fighting in more local conflicts before venturing further afield to find employment in arms.
That makes sense, right? If you're just a guy that gets raised up and then you find out that you actually like this life or you're pretty good at it and you can make a lot more money than what you were doing previously, then yeah, of course you want to go be mercenary, make more money and stuff like that.
Veteran mercenaries could command more money for their services, and experienced soldiers often turned to mercenary work as a means of leveraging their hard-won experience when the original conflict they had been mobilized to fight in was over.
This is just a revolving door. If we just take it for example, Afghanistan, right? We know all however we're going to talk about it, but if like all the soldiers that go fight in Afghanistan, right, for the United States, I'll use this as an example. They go fight, right? They get paid like shit. They get paid like $30,000, $40,000, right? Then they get out, right, and they have the experience because they went to Afghanistan, they did everything. Then they go for private contracting, which is basically mercenary work, and then they get paid like $100,000 something dollars. You see why people would do that.
In terms of training, these mercenaries would have practiced in similar ways to the aristocrats and freemen we previously described. However, owing to their profession, they would end up getting most of their training from ongoing participation in warfare. As such, medieval mercenaries were both valued and feared for their experience.
They were probably some of the most experienced guys. I'd even wager they do more experience than the aristocrats, just because of how much fighting they actually do.
Notorious mercenaries could then leverage this reputation to great effect. For example, the Englishman Sir John Hawkwood apparently struck such fear into the heart of opponents in 14th century Italy that he could demand their surrender without having to risk open battle. Other famous figures, such as Johannes Lichtenauer or Joachim Meyer, might be hired as weapons instructors or lead fencing schools. Yet men who pursued careers in violence were often viewed with suspicion by medieval authorities.
Medieval authorities probably means the church. Let's be honest. There's not much any. There's not other authorities really.
Thus, we have seen how the three main types of warriors in a medieval army trained for battle. There will be much more to cover when it comes to discussing how these elements came together and trained to fight as a cohesive whole, but that will have to wait for another time. For now, I hope this episode has proved both enlightening and entertaining. A huge thanks is owed to our supporters on Patreon.
So that's the end of the video, and I think this is a good slide to leave it off on. Actually, it's pretty good. I like these drawings; they're very good. Yeah, so go support them at the bottom link of the description for them. All my stuff, patrons down there. But yeah, I think it's a very interesting topic, and they did pretty well talking about this for medieval soldiers, especially the mercenaries. How they break down like the freemen being from towns and generalized, because freeman means a different term in England than it did for everywhere else. How to break down men at arms and everyone else. Very good. So if you like that video, leave a like. Otherwise, you can write in the comments. Write stuff whatever you want to down there. Otherwise, I shall see you people next time.